Welcome! This year, our celebration of women's history has taken us from sharing in writing a fraction of the gender inequities we faced in making our various paths to sharing in circles of lively and moving conversation our celebration of women who inspired us. One of our book clubs read about the African American woman fondly named the Firebrand by the First Lady, with whom she became friends. And we covered the auditorium wall with our struggles and victories. We celebrate joining the Women's March, the millions on every continent, women and men together, the youthful with the old, to make our voices heard for dignity, equality, justice, and the environment, with respect, with hope, and with faith that together we can make a better future for the children and the planet. Tomorrow evening, we share the artistic imagination and inspiring personal political vision of playwright Claire Koss, exploring women, race, and empowerment. Key concerns before us even now as we find ourselves still today faced with the necessity for we the people to declare the truth that Black lives matter. Welcome, Claire. This evening, we come together to consider the life and example of the woman in a war-torn world who led humanity in the Declaration of Human Rights, and to learn from a much-admired expert on Eleanor Roosevelt's life something of the struggles that made her. Blanche Cook discusses the intersection of Eleanor Roosevelt's public and private lives as a champion of her core issues: economic security, New Deal reforms, racial equality, and rescue, when they were sidelined by FDR as he marshaled the country through war and the chasm that grew between them. The volume just published and on sale here tonight at the incredible discount of 40%. See Louise Huddleston at the table and come to Yolanda's Ivy Room for a signing afterwards. Moves through World War II, FDR's death, the founding of the UN, and Eleanor's death in 1962. It follows the arc of war and the evolution of a marriage, as the First Lady realized the cost of maintaining her principles even as the country and her husband were not prepared to adopt them. The years covered in this third volume of the Cook biography are years that made Eleanor Roosevelt the unique woman she became: leader, visionary, guiding light. We can look forward to a lively Q&A. And while FDR's death in 1945 changed her world, she was far from finished, returning to the spotlight on the world stage as a crucial player in the founding of the United Nations. This evening, we are celebrating Eleanor Roosevelt in the years of our lives with Blanche Cook. Dear Blanche, we welcome you.
I'm so moved to be here tonight and to see all of you and to meet all of you. This is an amazing place. Tucker, thank you so much for inviting us. This has been for me a kind of wonderful journey. I thought I was going to finish this book by Eleanor Roosevelt's centennial year, 1984, but I was wrong. As Joe Lash said many times, Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite, and I'm happy to say I finally finished my 3 volumes, but Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite, and I'm lucky enough to have some graduate students who I'm encouraging to write about people who she was inspired by. And really, one of the things about this journey is that Eleanor Roosevelt never stopped growing and changing. And she was inspired by many people, including somebody named Esther Lape, L-A-P-E. And wherever I go, I say Esther Lape, L-A-P-E, because there is no biography of Esther Lape. Nobody has written about this most amazing woman who did many things. She founded something to support the World Court, and then promoted the United Nations, and then worked all of her life with groups of physicians to create what was supposed to be a single-payer health care plan in the 1935 Social Security Act. And the AMA lobbied it to death, and it didn't, it never got passed. Eisenhower, when he put in the Health Reinsurance Act, his initial vision was simple, just the way we had it in the military, everybody covered and their families covered, and he asked Esther Lape and Eleanor Roosevelt to help him get that Health Reinsurance Act passed in 1957. And again, the AMA lobbied it into what became the Health Reinsurance Act of 1957, a little bit less than what President Obama gave us finally in the new Health, essentially, Reinsurance Act. So we've never had a single payer, but it was what Esther Lape fought for from the 1930s until her death at the age of 100 in 1982. When Eisenhower signed the 1957 bill, he gave the pen, he signed it to in front of the press corps to Esther Lape, and she waved it to the journalist, and she said, "Now this represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae of what I had in mind." If anybody's looking for a book to write, I know there are former physicians and former nurses out there. Esther Lape worked with all kinds of physicians. There were physicians for single payer. She did a 2-volume study of American medicine in mid-century. There's great work to do. Right now, in this new queer era we're living in, and I don't mean queer as in gay, I mean odd as in who would have thunk it. It really is interesting to reconsider Eleanor Roosevelt, who in 1940 wrote a book called The Moral Basis of Democracy. And in 1940, she very specifically looked at the wave of dictators and fascists who had spread across the globe and asked, what does democracy require? What makes us democratic? And I've been very happy that some people have done a podcast recently saying, who's the opposite of our current president? Well, Eleanor Roosevelt is the opposite of our current president. And in this book, and it has a chapter related to this book, of the moral basis of democracy, she talks about how the danger of greed is very pernicious and very scary. And we have to be sure that we withdraw from the worship of the gods of mammon. And we have to be sure we end our infatuation with greed. Because we won't have democracy until there is education for everybody, housing for everybody, health care for everybody. And long before Bernie, in 1943, she actually wrote columns about how we have to have free public education, higher education, no tuition for everybody. And with that kind of economic security, we can imagine democracy. That's the basis of democracy. And then we have to be sure we end the bigotry and the discrimination that is so much part of the world we live in. In the process of, as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt growing and changing, I was really surprised when I interviewed Harry Belafonte, who we all know Harry Belafonte, the great singer, the great musicologist, and they were very close friends. And it turns out that in the 1950s, Harry Belafonte couldn't get an apartment in New York City. And so Eleanor Roosevelt wrote columns about how not only do we have to end school segregation, we have to end housing segregation. And then she wrote a column about Harry Belafonte and his family, and the fact that they couldn't get an apartment. And then she suggested that he and his family move in with her. And Harry said, no thank you. Because he and Lena Horne had decided to buy the building that wouldn't rent to them on West End Avenue, which they did. And so they bought this building and I guess integrated the neighborhood. The West End Avenue on the Upper West Side, which is very near where we live. But the question of what will it take to ensure democracy is really very interesting then and now. It will take us creating an economic level, in her words, below which no one is permitted to fall. And we have not yet discovered, she wrote, the economic secrets of full employment. Too many are left with nothing to do, and therefore without the chance to make a decent living. What do we think we're doing? What a question. As we look at it, who is talking about homeless people? Nobody's talking about it. Nobody is talking about the fact that we have folks in the United States literally starving. Nobody's talking about it. And we have this moment, I mean, I know I'm very clear about what Eleanor Roosevelt might say to Hillary Rodham Clinton. She might say, darling, men hate women with power, which is what she often wrote. When I think about the war that John Edgar Hoover unleashed against Eleanor Roosevelt, how, by the way, through the Freedom of Information Act, we got FBI files on Eleanor Roosevelt that are, it's about something like 4,000 pages. And the 80% of her FBI file is everything she said against lynching, everything she said against segregation, everything she said for civil rights and justice. That's what was un-American in John Edgar Hoover's un-American pantheon. And it really is interesting to look at who was called a communist in the 50s when the civil rights movement was burgeoning. People like Virginia Dare, who said, what we have to do is end the poll tax. We're not going to have a democracy until everybody can vote. We have to end the poll tax. And we have to end literacy tests. Virginia Dare, the great civil rights leaders who were partners with Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt was very much part of that movement. That we still are disenfranchising people, that we still, in some places, that we're restoring incredibly insane things like the literacy tests. I would like to point out, it's very easy to fail a literacy test because I taught at Hampton Institute in 1963. It was an historically black college, and 4 of us went to register to vote, and 4 of us failed the literacy test so that we couldn't vote. And how do you fail the literacy test when you're ABD, all but dissertation, from a place like Johns Hopkins, which was in my case, or a place like Harvard, which was the case of my 3 colleagues? The 4 of us went to vote, and we all failed because all you had to do was read the preamble to the Constitution. That's what you had to read, so we read it. And then the tester said, "Now what does that mean?" And we said what it meant. And she said, "No, that's not what it means." No matter what we said, she said, "That's not what it means, you fail." So if you teach in a historically black college, it was possible to fail. And of course, people just assumed that you were a person of color and struggled if you taught there, even though you might look white, as it were. What's white? So all of this is ongoing, and it's been ongoing in our lifetimes, and it's still ongoing. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very clear about it. One of the things that she says in the moral basis of democracy, it is often said that we are free, and then sneeringly free to starve. That is not an amusement. Nobody can say the Indians or Negroes of this country are free. Racial prejudice enslaves, and poverty enslaves. Other racial and religious groups labor under other discriminations. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1940. And this was the vision that she took with her throughout her life, and it really culminates in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when Harry Truman appoints her to the first delegation of the United Nations in 1946, and she's made chair of the committee that becomes responsible for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he then writes to her, "Do not support the economic and social rights that the Soviets are supporting. That's communism." And Eleanor Roosevelt writes back, "You can't talk human rights to people who are hungry. And if you want me to vote no on that, I will resign." And of course, Harry Truman doesn't want her to resign, and he says, "No, follow your conscience," and she does. And the U.S. supports both the economic and social rights and the civil and political rights. However, the Dixiecrats dominate Congress, and she knows that for the U.S. really to get this accepted, she will have to compromise, and she agrees to 2 covenants. And so, to this day, the U.S. has never even had a conversation about the economic and social rights covenant, which was introduced along with the civil and political covenant in 1966. And people don't know who is responsible for ratifying the civil and political rights covenant, because the person responsible for doing it never wanted credit, and the Democrats never wanted to give him credit. Does anybody know who is responsible for the ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and civil and political? It was George Herbert Walker Bush. The Soviet Union had collapsed, And George Herbert Walker Bush said, okay, this is a good time for us to stand behind the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if someday somebody writes an edible biography of father and son, George Bush hates daddy, George W. Bush does everything the opposite of what his father did. His father said, no, we're not going to war in Iraq. George W. Bush goes to war in Iraq. His father supports the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, civil and political covenant. No, we're not going to torture. No, we're not going to do these terrible things. And of course we know George W. Bush does. It's sort of interesting to me as an historian blessed by the fact that I live with a psychotherapist to inform me. The basis for this book is in many ways the struggle between Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR on things that she knew had to happen and campaigned for, and things that he knew she might be right about, but there was no way he could get the Dixiecrat-controlled legislature to support. And the biggest issue is race. And the second biggest issue is the failure to rescue Jewish refugees, the refusal to rescue refugees. And that's the tension between them, that's the struggle between them, and it really is interesting to see what Eleanor Roosevelt was capable of doing, even though FDR did not do anything to support her efforts. So one of as I said, there are some incredible surprises here for me. At one point, I said to Joe Lash's wife, Truda Lash, what's up with nobody giving you credit for the Varian Fry rescue operation? And this is a fascinating operation where Varian Fry, Scarlet Pimpernel, goes off to Marseille and helps to rescue about 1,800 people secretly, amazingly, people of great fame, people like Pablo Casals and Hannah Arendt, and musicians and artists and writers. And Truda Lash, whose name was Gertrude von Adam Wenzel Pratt Lash, is a very interesting person who never wanted any credit for some of the things that she did. And one of the themes in the book is the great friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Joe Lash, who became her biographer, and then Eleanor Roosevelt's sort of involvement in their romance and ultimately their marriage and Truda's divorce. It's a kind of interesting story because Truda was the same age as Eleanor Roosevelt when Eleanor Roosevelt found out about the Lucy Mercer affair. And she also had 3 children at that, or maybe she had 5 children at that time, and Truda had 3 children. And that Eleanor Roosevelt really promotes their divorce is sort of interesting, psychologically. But the bottom line is Truda was a member of the German anti-Nazi underground. She had graduated from the University of Freiburg in 1931, came to the United States, taught at Hunter, met Elliott Pratt, Pratt Oil, Pratt Institute, one of the most affluent people in the country. He followed her back to Germany where she was going to run an anti-Nazi paper, which the Nazis attacked and destroyed and killed her friends and editor. and then came to power. They got married in 1932, and as soon as Hitler came to power, he came back to the US. In 1940, she met Joe Lash, and in 1944, in 1942, they got divorced, she and Elliot Pratt. And then, you know, he wrote to her, why do you want a divorce? You have all the freedom you need. They clearly had an open relationship. So it's kind of fascinating story. But the bottom line is, when I said to her, shortly before she died, what's up with nobody giving you credit about the Bering Fry rescue operation? She banged her fist and said, don't write that. And I said, well, I'm going to write that. Why not? Ultimately, her children gave me 10 boxes of papers, and somebody someday will have to write a great biography of this great woman who really was a visionary. And one of the reasons Eleanor Roosevelt promoted their romance was it was a romance across all the divides, across race and religion and linguistic divides. And they represented to Eleanor Roosevelt the hope of the future. We can all learn to love one another. And at some point, and many times, Eleanor Roosevelt would write, we must learn to love one another or perish, which she wrote after the atom bombs were exploded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have to learn to love one another, or the world might just end. And I've dedicated this book to all those activists and agitators who resist tyranny, challenge authority, fight for peace, freedom, and human rights as we continue our journey for one world, no borders, no boundaries, no walls. And that was really a vision that Eleanor Roosevelt maintained to the end of her life. And this notion of one world, Wendell Willkie was a great inspiration for Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1940, Wendell Willkie runs against FDR, and they become friends. And then FDR sends him around the world. And he has this great epiphany, Wendell Willkie's great epiphany. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody, everywhere. We are all connected. One world. And that great book inspired Eleanor Roosevelt, and it inspired FDR. And as a matter of fact, in 1944, Willkie and FDR talked about running together as a new party, a really progressive party with a global vision. But in 1944, Wendell Willkie, and there needs to be a new biography, I think, of Wendell Willkie as well. Wendell Willkie, who drank too much and ate too much and loved too much, died very quickly of much too much. A series of incredible heart attacks. And that was the end of Wendell Willkie. I could go on for a long time, but I wonder if perhaps we shouldn't have some questions. I'm really fascinated that your book club is going to be reading Patricia Bell Scott's Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt, who is really, her friendship with Pauli Murray is really splendid. And I love it that Yale has just voted to name a new building for Pauli Murray. Okay, they had a building for a Southern slave owner, and they decided, okay, we'll get rid of that building and we'll name it after Pauli Murray. Patricia Bell Scott had never met Pauli Murray, and I've had some conversations with her recently, and she's going to, maybe for the paperback add a little bit, because Pauli Murray's friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt is amazing. She always felt, and her papers are at Radcliffe, and she writes very clearly about how she always felt she was in the wrong body. She really felt she wasn't a girl, she was a boy. And she told this to Eleanor Roosevelt, so that Eleanor Roosevelt embraces her, not just as the firebrand who politically is so radical, as a member of the student radical movement of the NAACP, but who personally is so radical, is a very interesting story. Like, who is Eleanor Roosevelt? That her heart is so expansive. So enjoy that book. It's a great book. And I hope you will also read Eleanor Roosevelt, Volume 1, 2, and 3. Because as Joe Lash said, Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite, with so many messages for us these days. Somebody asked me at dinner if I'd ever met Eleanor Roosevelt, and I had when I was student government president at Hunter, and I invited her to come talk with us, the students, at Roosevelt House, which had been her house, well, it had been her mother-in-law's house, and she hated it. So when Sarah and Eleanor Roosevelt died, they sold Roosevelt House to Hunter, and Eleanor Roosevelt came to speak, and she just electrified the room when she walked in. She was amazing. But her message, this was 1961, her message was, wonderful things are happening in North Carolina. Go south for freedom. And so we took 2 buses and sat in, and that was part of her legacy. She was still inspiring activist students to do the right thing and make a difference. One of the things that really appeals to me about Eleanor Roosevelt, as she went around the country and around the world, and people always say, how did she get to be that way? This daughter of privilege and affluence. She's Theodore Roosevelt's niece. How did she get to care so completely about so many people? And wherever she went, around the country and around the world, she wanted to make things better for people in want, in need, in trouble. And she always said, tell me, what do you want? What do you need? She never topped down, said, let me tell you, never. But the idea of being supportive to people in want, in need, in trouble is very important, because it was people just like her own mother and father. Her father was an alcoholic who died at the age of 34. And here we need to pause. I mean, how much do you have to drink to die at the age of 34? I mean, we're still here. Her mother essentially turned her face to the wall when Eleanor was 8, and her father died when Eleanor was 10. And we know enough about alcoholism, the family disease, to know about folks in want, in need, in trouble. After her parents died, she lived with her grandmother and her dysfunctional, one has to say, uncles and aunts, all of whom seem to have been alcoholics and drug-addicted folks. And then finally she was sent off to school in England to Allenswood, where she met this great mentor, Marie Souvestre, who really recognized Eleanor Roosevelt's talents, her independence, her leadership, and her brilliance and her ability to write. And it's Marie Souvestre who is her first mentor, who changes her life. At the end of her life, at the age of 76, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in a book, You Learn by Living, that the happiest day of her life was the day she made the first team at field hockey. It's 1961 when she writes this book. She's 76 years old. She's had a great life. And as she thinks back over it, the happiest day is the day she made the first team at field hockey. Well, pause. That was a very important connection because it meant to me several things. One, Eleanor Roosevelt loved sweaty, knockabout sports. Two, she's competitive and she wants to win. And that really told me a lot. So that as I began to look for what that meant, I found some wonderful things. In the first year in the White House, she writes to a friend, "Have you heard? I've done it. I've earned as much in my writings as Franklin has earned as president." Maybe even more. Competitive, sweaty, knockabout sports, and she wants to win. So, on that note, perhaps we can stop and you might have questions and comments, and I would be very pleased.
Yes, ma'am. I had the pleasure of having tea with Mrs. Roosevelt in 1960.
Take the mic, please. Thank you.
Yes, I had the pleasure of having tea with Mrs. Roosevelt in 1960 when I was a freshman at Vassar College. And as you probably know, she loved having us come up to Hyde Park from Poughkeepsie. But I never could understand why she felt so strongly about Kennedy and how she didn't like him. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Ultimately, she did like him and supported him with vigor. And I talked about that a little bit in the book. She didn't like Joe Kennedy, who was her, who she really thought was too pro-fascist and too too isolationist. As a matter of fact, Kennedy said we should never get into the war because we can't win it, so let the Germans win it. And he was, of course, fired by FDR and replaced by this great ambassador to England, John Wynant. And it was John Wynant who Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to, and Joe Kennedy was not somebody Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to. In the very beginning, she questioned whether John Kennedy was significantly opposed to McCarthyism, and she thought he wasn't. And she urged him to be more bold. Be bold, she said to JFK. But they met. They had a wonderful afternoon together, after which she decided he wasn't like his father at all, and she could and did support him with enthusiasm. And of course, JFK sent her back to the UN to be once again an ambassador to the UN, and made her chair of his commission on the status of women. At that point, however, she was very unwell and she didn't live to see the results of the Commission on the Status of Women, which set the feminist agenda, and Mary McLeod Bethune was on that committee. Some wonderful, wonderful women were on that committee, and they issued it to celebrate Eleanor Roosevelt, and it really did set up the feminist agenda.
I wonder if there's a story behind your question, Kay.
Yes.
Would you like to tell it?
Well, it was, at that time, as I say, I was a freshman at Vassar. And we used to bicycle up to Valkill, to Hyde Park. And Mrs. Roosevelt was one of the trustees of Vassar College. So she loved having us up there. And what amazed me about her is she did not photograph well. And I think the author will agree with me. She was a beautiful person, but she loved to tell us in the early days, this was in September, before the election in November, and we would ask her about Kennedy at that time, and she was very equivocal about it at that time because she really was an Adlai Stevenson fan. And it was interesting to me because Jackie Kennedy had attended Vassar and used to call us the College of the Vestal Virgins. So we asked a lot of questions about how she felt about that. Anyway, that's the story.
Thank you. Go ahead.
We all know that Eleanor did her greatest contributions with
Put the microphone so that it's right like this in your mouth.
Eleanor did her
Thank you.
greatest contributions after she was widowed, but Roosevelt used to complain about how she tried to influence him when he was president. Do you touch on any of that and what influence she tried to do with the president?
I do. One of the things about their partnership is Eleanor Roosevelt was his goad and his conscience, and he was her barometer. She always believed that he basically shared her vision for what should happen, but she understood that he had a sense of what could happen. So she's his conscience, he's her barometer. And the book is a lot about that. The question of rescue, for example. One of the great mysteries is that he never fires Breckinridge Long, who is the beast of the State Department, who says, we can't let these refugees in. All of these Jewish refugees are not just refugees, they're probably communists. They're probably un-American. They're probably our enemies. And FDR continues to promote him and put him in charge of the State Department's entire personnel network dealing with refugees. And his one goal is to delay, delay, delay. Don't give visas, don't let them in. And there's just one compromise, and I know somebody here has relatives who was saved by that compromise, which was Ruth Gruber and Harold Ickes called for haven, one haven, 1,000 people in Oswego, and that one settlement, one haven is built. Eleanor Roosevelt thought, there's all this empty space. There's lots of room in the U.S. for refugees. Look at Utah. Look at Iowa. There are hardly any people there. We can build, and we were taking in German prisoners of war. There were German prisoners of war coming in by, the shiploads. Why not refugees? And that really is a great tragic reality and mystery. FDR never got rid of Breckinridge Law until finally Henry Morgan's Law and the War Refugee Board issue a paper saying, it's a paper saying the U.S. is essentially as responsible as Germany for the slaughter of the Jews. We've got to start saving people. Yes?
So,
I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, so you may have mentioned this. Do you deal at all with any reference to Eleanor and the internment of the Japanese?
I do. This is the 75th anniversary of FDR's executive order to relocate the Japanese, which Eleanor Roosevelt was shocked by and opposed. Milton Eisenhower was put in charge of the Japanese relocation camps. He said it was the worst assignment of his entire life. When I interviewed him at Hopkins for a book I did on his brother, all he could talk about was how hideous and insane this was. It was, you know, just so unconstitutional, so immoral. And Eleanor Roosevelt opposed it in print and in person. And Milton Eisenhower felt, you know, really grateful that she did that. When she visited camps, she said, what we have to do is get these young people who want to go to school into school. And she set up with her friends so that any of the young people who wanted to go to school and to college would leave the camps and go to school and to college. Towson right here in Maryland, Goucher, I think Maryland, Eleanor Roosevelt got them out. And then, in addition, she supported the Japanese-American military division, which became, you know, the most awarded and the most heroic over the years. So she really did what she could, but of course, it wasn't enough.
I loved your book, and I read it some years ago, so I hope I remember correctly. But one of the things that struck me very much is was reading about Eleanor's relationship with the armed services, and I think it almost seems a little bit counterintuitive that she should have had such a very close interaction with the armed services, and I'm wondering if I'm remembering that correctly, and if you could talk to that.
Well, when you say you read it a couple of years ago, you mean you read volume 1 and 2 a couple of years ago. Volume 3 has just come out in November. You don't mean volume 3?
Definitely not. No.
Oh, okay. So her connection to the armed services. Eleanor Roosevelt made 2 important trips in volume 3 to war zones. One to London, where she was so impressed by how integrated the military in England was. And she got Eisenhower, who then goes over to England, to say, okay, we're not going to discriminate in we're not going to prevent black and white social connections, which had been prohibited until then. But the desegregation of the military does not happen until Eisenhower becomes president. Truman gets credit for desegregating the military because he said it should be done, but he didn't do it. It was Eisenhower who in 1953 went around to every single base and just removed bird colonels who wouldn't integrate. And then in 1958, as late as 1958, Eisenhower, by executive order, says, we are going to integrate blood plasma. People don't know that until 1958, blood plasma in the U.S. was black and white, Christian and Hebrew. Isn't that insane? It's not red blood, it's black and white, Christian and Hebrew. And Eisenhower sends General Al Gunther, the head of the Red Cross, a telegram saying, we're going to integrate blood plasma. We're just going to do it. And General Al Gunther, his buddy from World War II, writes back saying, I can't do that. The South doesn't want integrated blood. And so then Eisenhower says, well, then the South won't get any blood. Done. But it's that late. It's that late.
Were you also asking about her relationship to troops?
Yes.
She's known as a very caring and loving person in relation to the wounded soldiers, is that?
Yes, yes. She visits hospitals in the Pacific, in wherever she goes. She spends as much time as anybody will, can use. Tell me, what do you want? What do you need? Give me the address of your parents. I will write to them. She's amazing.
I want to say that Mrs. Roosevelt was very active with the Tuskegee Airmen, for she rode with one of the fellows and said, yes, you know how to fly.
She really is responsible for the Tuskegee Airmen getting not only recognized and the 999 fighting, the Red Fighting Forces. Let me get just a little bit. Because she does ride with this wonderful pilot, and she's smiling, she's behind him, and she says, this is it.
She has her picture taken.
She has her
with him
picture
and has it
taken.
publicized.
And then they get trained at Tuskegee, the 499, and they're delayed. They're not allowed to fly. They're not sent off to
Action.
action. This is March 1941. She spent an hour in the air seated behind pilot C. Alfred Anderson. And it was C. Alfred Anderson who was the chief flight instructor. There's one of the Tuskegee Airmen was a great professor at the Graduate Center named Dr. Roscoe Brown, who was a good friend of mine and one of the most decorated Tuskegee Airmen. And he said, fairness gave us a chance to be excellent. Ultimately, the 992 pilots trained at Tuskegee flew over 450 combat missions and was one of the most decorated of the combat groups. There's a wonderful book now called Red Tails, and Roscoe Brown was going to write a memoir. I don't know if he did. He passed this year, and I'm going to check out with his family to see if we can do something with, I know the memoir he was working on at the Graduate Center. But thank you for that, yes. And also, Eleanor Roosevelt wanted women in the Air Force and women in the military, including she wanted to get integrated women. And it was the head of the WACS, Ovida Culp-Hobby, who becomes Eisenhower's first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And Ovida Culp-Hobby, who's from Texas, was a life member of the NAACP. And she wanted the Women's Army Corps integrated and together in every situation. So there's another piece of that story that hasn't been fully told yet.
Apparently, Pauli Murray met Eleanor Roosevelt at a camp. There apparently were camps during the Depression for women. And we've all heard about the CCC and all the things for men. I wonder why the things for women are lesser known, and can you talk about that a little bit?
That's really such a good question, because Pauli Murray, there was only one camp for women. It was called the She camp. And it was Lake Tara. It was up in the Adirondacks. And Eleanor Roosevelt said it was outrageous that there were all these camps for young men, but nothing for women. And it was Pauli Murray, who was one of the young women. She was a Hunter student, and, you know, a member of this She camp, and that's how they first met. But it was, you know, women were discriminated against. They just didn't get a fair share of anything out of the New Deal or the war.
Well, I'm sure that you join me in your delight that we've had such an excellent speaker and such a knowledgeable person share about such an inspiring subject, and we thank you very much, Blanche.
Thank you.